Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaylin. I am a second year PhD student in history and African American studies at Yale, and today we're talking all about comprehensive exams. I began preparing for comprehensive exams at the beginning of the spring semester, and I've received many comments asking for me to discuss what the process actually is, what the requirements are, and how in the heck you are meant to read up to 200 books in just under a year. I'm going to attempt to make this video short, sweet, and to the point. We're gonna be talking about what comprehensive exams are, what the purpose of them is, as well as what the requirements are specifically for Yale, and then I'm gonna be finishing off by talking a bit about how I'm planning on preparing. So if you're interested in what the US PhD comprehensive exam process is like, then go ahead and stick around. To begin, let's talk a little bit about what comprehensive exams actually are. So comprehensive exams are essentially one in the 4 steps to getting a PhD in a US PhD program. So generally speaking, PhD programs in the United States have 4 technical hoops that you have to jump through. First is typically coursework. Depending on your program, you may have between 1 and 3 years of coursework. Here in my program at Yale, I have 2 years of required coursework, but if you came in with a master's, you only have 3 semesters worth of coursework you need to complete. Within that, there are other requirements, but I'll go ahead and leave that depending on your school because it really varies depending on which department you're in. The second hoop that you have to get through is comprehensive exams, and the second and third hoop can technically be interchangeable depending on your program. So some programs will have you do comprehensive exams first and then submit the prospectus, or the other way around. It really depends on your program. Comprehensive exams, otherwise called qualifying exams, vary depending on the school. So some schools it's actually a sit-down exam. Others, you have 24 hours to write, for example, an essay. Others, for example, like Yale, have an oral exam that is also combined with a written component. Then you'll have your prospectus, which is essentially the proposal for your dissertation, and then you have the dissertation defense at the end. There are many steps in between. So for example, submitting grant proposals or submitting chapters of your dissertation for review, but those are minor steps within the kind of overall process. So I break it down essentially by 4 hoops that you have to get through. So this is essentially 2 of the 4 for me. So I'm gonna be taking comprehensive exams in fall of 2022 at Yale in the history department. You're meant to take it between your 5th and your 6th semester. And so this will be my 5th semester that I'm planning on taking it. Some students will wait until their 6th semester, but it honestly varies depending on the student. So I'm planning on taking it in the fall, which means that I have essentially 9 months to prepare. I plan on taking it in around October, but it honestly depends on my committee, what their schedule is like, as well as my preparations. Therefore, in a minute, I will talk a little bit more about the requirements for Yale, but I want to talk next about the purpose behind comprehensive exams. When I started posting about comprehensive exam preparations at the beginning of the semester on TikTok and on YouTube, I got a lot of questions about what is the purpose, because especially in the UK or the EU, other places in the world, PhD programs don't typically have comprehensive exams. It's really about either coursework and the dissertation or just the dissertation component. And so this seems like a very foreign concept to many people. But here in the US, qualifying exams or comprehensive exams is par for the course. And that is because US PhD programs, in my opinion, are more centered around what you're going to contribute as a professor in the field of study and thinking more towards your teaching. That includes teaching opportunities. For example, most programs will require that you TA or TF a class, so you become a teaching assistant or teaching fellow and you help teach a course during your PhD. This is not required in other schools around the world. And so the US is really focused on the teaching and pedagogical component of your studies in addition to the research that you're conducting as someone writing a dissertation and potentially publishing articles along the way. And so with that in mind, comprehensive exams are really focused, at least from what I have been told, they are really focused on providing you with the foundation so that way you are able to then teach courses both as a TA as well as when you go and enter the academic job market. Within comprehensive exams for history, you have 3 different or 4 different reading lists. And these reading lists are essentially meant to supply you with current knowledge of where that field of study stands. So for example, I have my 3 fields, which is Atlantic World Slavery, Early Modern English Empire in the Atlantic, as well as Black Women's History of the United States. Essentially, those 3 reading lists are meant to prepare you for teaching survey classes. With the reading that I'm doing for Atlantic World Slavery, the idea is that you would enter the job market with the ability to teach a course on early African American history or Atlantic World Slavery. Same thing with the other subjects. Ideally, you're using your list not only to prepare you for the dissertation, but you're also using it as a way to analyze the current state of the field and improve your knowledge in various areas. Oftentimes people think of the PhD as narrowing your knowledge to a very specific field, and that is absolutely true because with your dissertation, you're going to end up specializing in such a way. However, with the PhD in the United States, they want you to be as eligible for teaching positions in the future, in which case they want to prepare you to write syllabi and to be able to discuss the major trends within the field of study, as well as the methods and sources that are typically used within that subfield. And so, for example, the Atlantic World Slavery reading list, it goes roughly chronologically, but it also is very thematic. So for example, I'll have a list on the transatlantic slave trade, and that's really focused on different methods of analysis used within Atlantic slave trade studies. So that'll include anthropological studies of West Africa, and it includes the quantitative work of Philip Curtin, who was one of the first to actually perform a thorough quantitative analysis of the Atlantic slave trade. And then you also have the work of David Eltis that contributed to the Atlantic slave trade database. The other lists that you might have are, for example, gender and children in the system of slavery. It'll also include free Blacks in North America, and it also includes literature on the Caribbean. But depending on your examiner and depending on your own particular interest, your list is going to look different than someone that took it perhaps last year, or even somebody that's taking a very similar subject this current year. There's not a set list that you are given. However, you can look to previous lists for influence. For example, there are going to be certain books that your examiner is going to require that are on your list, but you can also add books in and around that in order to fill the gaps in your own interest. So for example, my Atlantic World Slavery list in particular is very legal history and gender history focused. And that's due to my dissertation interests. I'm really interested in matrilineal descent and the concept of inheritability within property law and within the law of slavery in the English Atlantic in the 17th century. So my lists really focus on those particular trends. However, the list that I've created with all 3 of my examiners really vary in terms of the different trends that they're tracking, and also include books that I have had no experience with, is looking at topics that I've never taken survey classes on. And so it's really pushing me as an individual scholar to explore the broad field of study rather than just thinking about the dissertation. While it may seem tedious, and it's definitely anxiety inducing, I do actually think that comprehensive exams are hugely beneficial. I have to say, though I'm at the beginning stages of my comprehensive exam preparations, I have already had so many new ideas and feel so much more immersed in the literature than I have when I was in coursework. One challenge that I had with coursework in particular is that while you're taking classes that may be generally connected to your interests, a lot of the weeks and the readings don't really align with what it is that you want to be learning. And what's really cool about comprehensive exams is it allows you to really develop a list where you can explore the areas that you want to. And you can do that in a close reading kind of way because you're not trying to rush through it. You're giving yourself enough time to actually get through those readings thoroughly. That being said, I think that the purpose of comprehensive exams is ultimately to prepare you for the academic job market. It's also to prepare you for discussions that are going to be had with your undergraduate students as a TA. And at the moment, I think that it's hugely beneficial. However, I have not taken the exams yet, so ask me again in like October or November what I think about them. But at this moment, as I'm beginning to prepare, I think that it is a worthwhile endeavor within the PhD training. And ultimately, I am very glad that this is part of the program that I am in. Now let's talk about Yale's history PhD requirements. I'm discussing this because as a history PhD student, you have different requirements than other fields of study. So if you are a PhD student, but you're not looking to study in the humanities and you're not looking to study history, you can always go skip to the preparation portion of this video. But for those of you that are planning on studying history or considering the PhD, I'll talk a little bit about the requirements at Yale that are similar to the requirements that are going to be at other schools. However, I will say that, again, this is very Yale specific. So if you're looking for the requirements for other schools, go ahead and check their graduate student websites. So at Yale, you are meant to take your comprehensive exams between the 5th and your 6th semester at the school. And within that, you are meant to take one major field and 2 or 3 minor fields. Your major field of study should be with your primary advisor, who's going to be your dissertation advisor. I came into the program here at Yale knowing that I wanted to study early America and slavery. I'm part of the history and African American studies joint PhD program. So I needed my primary examiner to be someone from both departments. And it just so happens that my examiner is my advisor, and they're also very well versed in this subject. So Atlantic World Slavery is my major field, and then my 2 minor fields, as I said before, are Early Modern English Empire in the Atlantic world and Black women's history of the United States from 1619 to 1970. I had considered having a 4th field, so another minor field in legal history. However, when I started actually writing up the lists that I wanted to dive into, I ultimately found that those lists were getting quite long and I didn't want to add another examination factor to my comprehensive exam preparations. Also, with the comprehensive exam, oral exam, you are also required a few different written components. With your major field, you're meant to submit an 8,000 word written sample 2 weeks prior to the exam. And this is meant to go over the general trends within that field of study. And with your minor fields, you're meant to write a syllabi. So the syllabi are going to become really helpful when you enter the academic job market. As far as I'm aware, you are meant to supply syllabi or potential courses that you might teach when you do enter the academic job market. However, I am no expert. I have not entered the job market. I have not done a ton of research on it. I am also only a second-year PhD student, so this may change over time. However, from what I've heard from other students, the syllabi are really helpful when you go to apply for other programs. Now let's talk a little bit about the oral exam component. So you are meant to go into a room with your 3 examiners, and your primary examiner has 60 minutes to ask you questions about your field of study, and then your minor field examiners have 30. However, if you have 3 minor fields, then each of your examiners, including your primary examiner, have 30 minutes each. So some students have opted to do the 4 different lists, so that way their examiners only have 30 minutes apiece. However, I only have 3, so I have my major field and 2 minor fields, which means that my primary examiner will have 60 minutes and the other 2 will have 30. Within this, they can ask you essentially anything, and every examiner has their own style, and it's important to figure out what you think those examiners may ask, because from what I've heard, it can vary. So when I first heard of comprehensive exam and when I was asking questions to previous students about what the process was like, I truly thought that the way that they would go about it is primarily historiographical. So what I mean by that is that I believed that you went into the exam, they said, so Genovese argues this, what do you think about this by comparison to what Edmund Morgan says? And this is just a really terrible example, but that's what I thought the exam was. And while it can be that, from what I've heard, some examiners will ask questions that are a bit more focused on pedagogy and teaching and a little bit more about method. So for example, what do you think the use of biography does within this field of study? Or do you think that it's beneficial within this particular piece? It's a little bit more opinion-based, and it's meant to test your ability to discuss a topic on the fly. Ultimately, it sounds like a very nerve-wracking process, but from what I've experienced in classes with cold calls and professors calling on me and saying, hey, Kaylin, what did you think about this particular subject or this particular use of this source? I have had questions like that in class. I imagine it's not going to be super different, but I'm also preparing for the worst and am trying to read as thoroughly as possible. So that's essentially the Yale History PhD comprehensive exam requirements. But now I'm going to talk a bit about how I am actually preparing. One thing I get asked a lot about is how much time I actually read per day, and it truly varies. So I try to read 5 days a week at minimum, and I try to read between 4 and 9 hours a day. I have a method of jumping between texts because at the moment I am also doing preparations with all 3 of my examiners. Originally, I was planning on only doing preparations with maybe 1 or 2. However, all 3 of my examiners seemed to be available this particular semester, and they asked if I wanted to be doing mocks now. And so that's what we've been doing, in which case that is a lot of reading that you have to have done in preparation for those meetings. Some of my examiners have less reading that they require per meeting. Others require a bit more. Some are a little looser on what they want read by the time of the meeting. Others are a little bit more strict. Ultimately, I feel the most at ease when I, for example, read for an hour out of one book, skip to another book for an hour, go to another book for an hour, and then come back to the original book. I talked a little bit about this in my time management video, but time blocking and really moving between texts is what helps me and my brain feel like I'm making progress. Another reason that I do this is because when you're thinking about the literature, I think it's also important to think about all of these books in conversation with one another. I'm also trying to make connections between them because I imagine that there may be questions during my exam where they will ask how one book connects to another, or why I think a particular theme is important in one, and that same book may come up on somebody else's list, and they may ask a slightly different question based on the previous question. I know this is confusing, but ultimately, when I'm reading, I am thinking about the types of questions I may be asked and thinking about how I might actually respond. And it is helpful for me to be able to say, well, although I think that this particular argument was not as well cited or wasn't as well supported, I think that a similar argument but in this book is actually much better supported. And so there's a way for you to go from one piece of literature to another and kind of turn the question on its head. But this is a method that I've learned from other PhD students. We'll talk a little bit about networking in a second. But ultimately, with scheduling time and figuring out how to actually get through so many books, moving between books and coming back is what's been the most helpful. And the other thing to keep in mind is that although I think I have about 170 or so books on my list, I'm not reading every single one of them cover to cover, primarily because I am a very slow reader. And as much as people have told me you can train yourself out of that, I don't believe it to be true. I have always been a slow reader. I think I will always be a slow reader. People ask me all the time, how do you read faster? And it's not about reading faster, it's about reading more strategically. I do have my How I Read video coming very, very soon. However, there are some books that I am reading cover to cover, and there are others that I am skimming and also reading reviews on. Some people ask me if I read the reviews first or if I read them after. It honestly depends on the book. There are certain books, especially those focused on a bit more theory, that I tend to read the review first, mostly because I find theory really difficult to comprehend. And so it's a lot easier to me, at least, to go read the review and then know what to look for as I'm reading. But when it's something that's a little bit more coherent, the argument's a bit more clear, I try to read the actual literature first and then move on to the review. But every book's a little bit different. I'll talk about this in the reading video, but you also get a sense of what your examiners are looking for and what it is that you think they're gonna ask you questions on, and you read certain things more thoroughly than others. I have been wrong in the past. There are books that my examiners would have expected me to have read very thoroughly that I had skimmed, and now I have to go back and read a bit more thoroughly, but it's all a learning experience. I'm still figuring it out. I'm still in the early stages, but ultimately, knowing that there are between 150 and 200 books on your list, you do figure out how to manage your time and what it is that you need to be focusing on the most. This is also based on advice that I was given by other PhD students. I talked to previous students in my program, I've talked to students in other programs, and all of them essentially had the same advice, which is there are certain books you're going to want to read very thoroughly. There are others where you really just need to be able to skim and then read the reviews. Ultimately, you have to figure out what books that you think are the most important and what to prioritize and what it is that you can potentially save some time on. Another thing that I'm doing to prepare for my comprehensive exams is getting to know my examiners. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the video, but I think one thing that's really important is getting to know the people that are on your committee and getting a sense of the types of questions they tend to ask. Some examiners are really historiography focused, others are a little bit more methods focused, others will actually ask you questions about how you would approach answering a question if an undergrad were to ask you, and how it is that you would go about answering it based on the literature. It varies, and I think it's important to get to know them by doing mocks, by doing preparation meetings, in order to see what types of questions they ask and how it is that you tend to respond. That way you also get a sense of what literature they think is important. You may have a guesstimation of what a faculty member may think is important within the field of study, and sometimes you could be wrong, and the more you get to know them, the more classes you take with them, the better prepared you are to take that exam with them. Another piece of advice that I was given is to talk to previous students. So ask previous students that have taken exams with that particular faculty member what books they tend to focus on or what you should be paying attention to. Also ask their previous PhD students what they tend to be the most interested in, because again, getting to know your examiner, getting to know what types of questions they tend to ask will help you in the long run. This has also helped with classes. I noticed that even in coursework, if I had a particular professor that I started to get to know a bit better, I started to be able to guess what types of questions they were going to ask me in class and then read accordingly. Get to know your examiners, read accordingly, and then also talk to other students about what it is that you should be focusing on. You want to pull as many resources as you can as a PhD student, and this is something that I've been implementing within my own practice and preparations, so that way hopefully I pass my exams and pass it in flying colors. All right, we've now reached the end of the video. I hope that this wasn't too rambly. I tried to keep it short and sweet, but there's a lot of information to pack in here. I hope that you enjoyed this one and learned a little something about comprehensive exams in the US, as well as specifically within the field of history. And if you have any further questions, please comment down below. Again, I have that reading video coming. I know all of you have been asking for it. It is on the way, I promise. I'm gonna be working on it this week. I hope you have a lovely day. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye everyone.